Welcome. The Hyatt Student Fund Board would like to welcome you to our event. We appreciate the great turnout. Today, there will be another event at 2:30, and it's going to be a panel discussion between our guests here, Chris Segoyan, Professor Andrew Wood, Michael Collins, Megan Stiefel, who will be joining us by Skype due to Hurricane Irma. She's been kind enough to still join us. And then Mr. Dembosky will also be joining us for that part. Luke Dembosky is co-chair of the Debevoise and Plimpton's Cybersecurity and Data Privacy Practice, and he was also a Deputy Assistant Attorney General in the national security area for over 15 years. He has been kind enough to join us today, and if you'll give him his attention, here he is.
Thank you, Eric. This is an incredible turnout. Thank you to everyone for turning out for this. I feel honored on a Friday afternoon with a hurricane approaching and college football started and everything else. So thank you to Eric, to Keen, and everyone else and at the school for inviting me to do this. It's a great honor. Just a little word about my background. Eric promoted me a little bit there, or at least extended a promotion for me a little bit. I started out as a private litigator. I always go through this with students because I was a student, and it was always curious to me how people got where they did in their career path. And so I went to my hometown law school, University of Pittsburgh, came out and I clerked a year for federal appellate court, became a commercial litigator in Philadelphia, did that for some years, and then threw my name in the ring to become a prosecutor. And when I walked in the first day at the office in 2002, they said to me, well, we figure you're the youngest person here, you must know all about computers, so we're going to throw you in the computer crime and intellectual property unit, which my wife, who is an actual technology person, science, hydrogeology person, thought was hilarious because we still had a VCR and I still struggled to program it. She said, do they know they've hired an idiot to guard the cyber defenses of the country? So I did that and please excuse me moving around. I'm too fidgety to stand at any one spot. And as we get going, I'm going to invite you to interject with questions. We'll leave some structured time at the end for questions, but I want you to jump in. So I did that for 8 years, and a lot of my customers were, of course, in other countries. I had a lot of targets, defendants in Eastern Europe, various parts of the world, West Africa, all over, and really got the international bug. And DOJ would then send me to do trainings in places. I would go to places like Colombia and travel around cities training local prosecutors and national police on how to do these cases and put them together. So you come a long way from not knowing anything on your first day. No, you don't have to have a technology background. They train you. In my case, it took a village to train me, and threw a lot of spaghetti at a lot of walls to make stuff stick. And in the end, you get there and you find yourself the one traveling and teaching these courses. Then in 2010, I wasn't sure if they were exiling me or promoting me, but they said, we'd like you to go to Moscow, to the embassy. Really? Getting rid of me? And so they said, no, we've always put a gangs and narcotics person there, what we always called a drugs and thugs prosecutor. And we'd like to, this whole cyber thing looks like it's going to stick around. Russia's pretty important. You have 37 defendants in Russia, we noticed. Maybe you'd like to go and break bread with these people and see what we can learn. And so I said yes. My family begrudgingly towed along. We were there for 2.5 years, and they loved it. They had the full expat experience, living the dream world, while I was traveling a lot with the FSB and riding on the Russian metro every morning. Not so much fun, but still a great experience. So after 2.5 years, got back to to the U.S. and was asked to go to D.C. and head the criminal division cyber prosecutions as a deputy chief in the computer crime and intellectual property section of DOJ's criminal section. This is, picture people with giant brains, so giant they can't really walk a straight line, very policy wonky people. And they hired me, and I said, why? I'm like a knuckle-dragging prosecutor from the field. That's what we want. We want we want someone to bring the cases. Go out and break stuff, so to speak. And so we turned it up a notch or two, I like to think, because we turned up the aggressiveness in terms of going out and forging international relationships, doing more cutting-edge operations. We had to respond to some things like the Target breach, the Home Depot breach, which my firm represented the board on the civil side before I left for private practice. We had a whole spate of breaches in the healthcare sector, Anthem, Premera, a whole bunch of Blue Cross affiliates. And so things were really spinning up fast in the data breach world. And I got recruited at that time to go over to the national security side. And they had never had a portfolio, a real structured portfolio at Justice on national security issues. And they said, will you come over and lead this? And I said, I've sort of been on the prey side of national security living in Russia. I've never been a pursuer. And they said, don't worry, you know the ropes, you can figure it out, you have the situational awareness, and we need somebody to lead on the cyber issues. And I thought, well, at least I'm done with that Friday night breach call. At least I don't have to give up my weekends and holidays for breaches. And not 3-4 weeks in, I get a call from Nicole Seligman, the president of Sony Pictures, saying something's going on, it's the North Koreans, it looks like all hell is breaking loose over this movie. I need help. And this is 10:30 Friday night, I'm in my kitchen, and we jump on the phone with FBI, and we go from there for a period of months trying to deal with that. We had our investigation of denial of service attacks by Iranian groups on the U.S. financial sector, and as we'll see in a minute, we had the first ISIS and other terrorist use of cyber for real operational means, not just as a recruiting tool. And so I guess you could describe me as a bit of a Forrest Gump, where I've been in a lot of these photographs over the years, just through good karma or bad, depending on your perspective. But just being in various places at the right or wrong time, you sort of get these experiences and you find yourself gaining titles and learning new things. And so I highly recommend that you consider it. You may have your heart set on being a mergers and acquisitions lawyer or whatever, ERISA lawyer, real estate lawyer, it's all great. You'll never be bored in a technology-driven area like cybercrime or IP. These areas are fast-moving and always interesting. So what I thought I would do today is share some experiences about a little bit about the evolution of how, from my perspective, we got here, where it is now in the state of play, and where it's going, some of the key issues. I'm hardly the best at any one of these things, even in this room. We have serious technologists here that Chris is here and others here. They know way more about the technology than I do, and you should ask them about that. I know enough to be dangerous on the technology. I know a lot about the geopolitical. I've been in the negotiations with a couple different countries over the years, been to the UN for DOJ on these issues. And so my experience is a mix of legal, response, now on behalf of companies in my role at Debevoise, with former DOJ teammates and others of more privacy focus, to help companies. So my experience is a mix of different things, and I don't pretend for any of it to be the complete view of anything, but I'll offer what I have. Feel free to interject with questions. So this is the current state of characters, or a sampling. Now, I'm a little biased because all but one or two of these were my customers, so to speak, or cases that I worked heavily on. And another one was led by my partner, Jim Pastore, who was a prosecutor in the Southern District of New York, specializing in these cases. I used to fight with his bosses over cases when I was based as an AUSA in Pittsburgh. and then we all became friends in the end. Jim was a rising star. And you'll probably recognize, of course, the Guy Fawkes mask of Anonymous and the offshoot group, LulzSec. Jim led the prosecution of their LulzSec's top people using the nicknames Sabu and Anarchaeus, Hector Monsegur and Jeremy Hammond, and a number of other significant cases. In the top left, in my view, represents, in the past few years anyway, the top of the food chain in the criminal hacking sense. That's Yevgeny Bogachev. He's a Russian national, and he was the, according to the Justice Department, the architect or manipulator behind what's known as the Game Over Zeus botnet. Now, if you don't live in this world, you don't know what a botnet is, think of the movie World War Z, where you have a whole bunch of zombies. It's basically, they put out malware that blankets and infects computers around the world. They'll build it to a certain size. They'll target certain types of computers to include in their bot army. And all of these have some of their bandwidth secretly reporting to another master, them. They'll report to a command and control server or an IRC channel where they can receive commands and be used to flood websites with requests, to funnel wire payments and things out of banks, as in the case of Game Over Zeus. But they, law enforcement and others give names to these botnets, and the security research community gives names to them. And the worst one, as of a couple years ago anyway, was Game Over Zeus. It was doing about $100 million in damage a year to the U.S. Financial sector alone, mostly in the form of redirected wires, sometimes with diversionary attacks. And Bogachev was charged with masterminding the botnet, using other tools. Everybody knows about ransomware now. He was one of the folks behind a really nasty variant of ransomware a couple years ago called CryptoLocker. It actually had multiple versions over the years. And so he remains at large. He's indicted. Some of his cohorts are no longer at large, but it was a large operation to do two things by the government. One was to bring charges and make some arrests, seize some assets, physical assets. The other was to use injunctive relief to take over the actual bot army. In other words, to get court approval to execute a technical solution, to have the bots, all the World War Z participants, report to us at the time, the FBI, an FBI server under court authority to report. We call this sinkholing the bots. And once you've got that tiger by the tail, you have to figure out what you're going to do with a couple million compromised computers reporting to your server, and you're under court order. So that's another problem for another day. In the middle, top, is what the Sony employees saw on their screens the day of the attack that supposedly was inspired by the Interview movie that offended North Korea. On the far right at the top is another end of the spectrum, which is representative of nation-state hackers. This is the one that I was not involved with, but it was an indictment by the National Security Division before I got there of 5 members of the People's Liberation Army who were charged with hacking into U.S. companies to steal commercial trade secrets so that China could give these secrets to its own companies in the private sector for commercial advantage. And so this was the first case of its kind to be brought. The U.S. government brought it, arguably knowing that the chances of arresting these folks once they're outed and named and shown in their uniforms is next to nothing. But why do you bring the case? The case makes a statement, arguably, that we can figure out who you are, even if you're the most sophisticated people, and we're going to call you out and embarrass the government that harbors you or sent you. And so that has had some political ramifications that I'm going to get to in a minute. On the bottom left is representative of quasi-state affiliated groups. This is This is representative of a case in which two different Iranian hacking groups with some affiliations to the government, at least as alleged by DOJ, were involved in carrying out the denial of service flood attack that I mentioned earlier on the U.S. banks for over 170 days a couple years ago, disrupting customer access to the websites, costing many millions of dollars in losses to try to get the sites back up and running and fend off these continuous attacks. One of the hackers, found himself with access to the controls for the dam in Rye, New York. And thankfully, the sluice gate controls were offline for maintenance. Otherwise, it's possible that he could have controlled the gate and potentially flooded the area, flooded the town. In the bottom represents, of course, you recognize ISIS, their flag. We've seen for a number of years terrorist groups use cyber means to recruit, of course, but they've also started to apply cyber means to their operations. And one of the last cases I supervised as Deputy Assistant AG for National Security was the Ardit Farizi case. And Farizi was a Kosovo national, a Kosovar, who was studying in Southeast Asia. He made connections with Junaid Hussain, who was at the time ISIS's top hacker type, and became arguably a sympathizer for ISIS. He hacked websites in the United States that were frequented by members of the U.S. military, other federal employees, but mostly military folks, and provided the hacked publicly identifiable information to Junaid Hussain of ISIS. The reason for this was so Hussain could take the information and develop targeting packages. So what Hussain did was cull the list down to the actual people that he wanted to target, about 1,200 or so, and go out and look at their social media pages, LinkedIn, whatever else was available to put together pictures of them, their family, their home, and tweet it out around 1,200 targeting packages in the U.S. saying, brothers and sisters in the United States, I want you to go down the street and take these people out. This is crowdsourced terrorism, basically. He said you don't need a visa to come, you don't need to come to Syria, you don't need to come to Iraq or wherever, Afghanistan. You can go down the street and kill where you live, and this, as you can imagine, caught the attention of law enforcement, prosecutors, national security folks. Farizi was arrested and extradited from the Philippines, and he has pled guilty in the Eastern District of Virginia. And I mentioned the anonymous characters who represent, of course, if you don't know, ideologically motivated hacking, for destruction purposes or mayhem purposes or to make a point for the most part. They were dealt a pretty serious blow, in large part because of my partner Jim's work, as I mentioned, when their leadership was taken out. What you find with groups like Anonymous in general is there's about 2% of the members have some skills and talent, and the rest are pretty low-level punks who will download a tool, a software tool created by the 2% folks, and press enter and launch it at somebody, in a pretty scripted way. That poses real legal issues because, and you guys have to solve this in the future, please. One is, how do you sentence somebody who causes tons of damage by, in a knee-jerk reaction with little or no planning, saying, oh, this looks cool, yeah, enter, and is part of a bot army attacking a site, taking down a business network, causing a lot of damage, and then they go in front of a judge for sentencing, and the prosecutor says they've caused, $6 million in damage. There they are. They're 18 years old, 20 years old. Some of them are juveniles. How do you sentence them under the U.S. sentencing guidelines? If you read the guidelines straight up, they're going to get years and years and years in prison. But what they did seemed to be just sort of simple and casual. So that's a real sort of policy, legal question to grapple with. So how did we get here? This is a very crude summary, and it's kind of a Luke, me-centric summary because it's kind of what I've seen myself and observed. It doesn't really come from books so much. But when I started prosecuting these cases, and for the people right before me, there were a lot of lone actors. A lot of them had juvenile motives. So these were kids with, the Mountain Dew cans piled up in the pizza boxes, defacing the Pentagon's website and doing just destructive mayhem for bragging rights. They quickly realized, wow, that we could make some money doing this, and if we really keep our mouth shut, we can do it for longer. Like if we bragged less about it online and in bars or wherever we were, we could actually make money and continue to sustain it because nobody seems to be coming after us really in Romania or wherever we are. You did see group affiliations beginning in the 1990s, especially in Eastern Europe. Some of the first carding forums that went up. These are websites, underground websites. Many of them have migrated to what you probably all know as the dark web, which most of us refer to still as the Tor network, which is a whole other story. But it's basically an underground website where you can trade in stolen loot online. And at least a lot of the early variants, people talked in the public space where they could post messages for most or everybody to see about things like, what's the track to data on the credit card, what's Visa doing now, how's the hologram change, they're talking sort of around criminality potentially, but it's not really criminal yet. And then they would go off and make deals with each other in private one-on-one chat variants on the sites. The Russians and other Eastern Europeans quickly developed this and started to dominate the market early. Western groups began to emerge. I prosecuted a case in the mid to late 2000s against a character named Iceman Max Butler. He had set up a site called Carter's Market. He became known as a hacker's hacker, and he really angered a lot of people because one day the members of 4 different forums woke up, other carding forums, competitors of his in the fraud underground, and he had hacked their sites and brought all their members to Carter's Markets. They logged on and said, "Welcome to your new home, Carter's Market." So he basically left a shell for the administrators of these other forums, and he started to rival, Carter's Market started to rival some of the top Russian groups in terms of sophistication, membership, the sort of damage that they were doing. So we saw that sort of migrate west to here. Other groups followed. We saw huge hacks like the TJX hack and others that went exponentially beyond what Butler and his group could do. We started to see then cottage industries. If you have a criminal market and it's really making millions of dollars, not everybody has the skills to be the one to actually hack in, and not everyone that has those skills wants the mess of getting the cash out. So services crop up to help them go to the next step. So bulletproof hosting, we used to call anyway, is basically like hosting for bandits. Like, you can keep your stuff hosted on my site in Ukraine or somewhere, and I'm not going to keep any records. I'm not going to ask questions necessarily. If law enforcement comes by, I'm not going to cooperate with them, and guess what? They usually don't come here. So it became a cottage industry for that. You have others like checkers who would take your hacked credit card information that you want to see how valuable it is, run it through a database and tell you how current the cards were, what the average balances were in the accounts, all sorts of things, whether it was still a valid card or anyone had canceled it, and you could sort of get an idea for the value of what you were going to turn around and resell or use, and what to keep for yourself and what to sell and how to price it. Specialization continued along with infrastructure building. Rather than have a bespoke setup for every hack we do, why don't we set up a basic command and control center, so to speak, a dashboard, as it's called, where we have our botnet, we have our exploit kits, we have this stuff that we're selling, we'll have certain infrastructure. we may want to have our bots or the exfiltration of the data come through an encrypted channel. We could set that up by hacking a university like Vanderbilt and running through their servers, and I won't speak for Vanderbilt, but many university servers, hospital servers have been used for these purposes. But you also see criminals leasing the space. So they'll set up a fake company, they'll lease a VPN or encryption tunnel to be able to do that, and it becomes part of their infrastructure just like a botnet. What we see now among some of the top groups is that a number of them have pulled the resources back in. Like they're tired of paying Joe or Larry over there or Sergey or Yuri for this. If they can bring that in-house, they can make more money and be profitable. But you have to be a little bit careful because the more you look like Walmart, the more surface area you have, or the more you look like the Gambino crime family, you start to become vulnerable because you have regular channels of communication. More people kind of know a little bit about you. Most of them don't know who each other is. Some places they do. Some of the top groups in Russia, the folks actually really know each other, and they have pretty cozy government relationships and cozy situations. And the best bet for law enforcement is to try to figure out where they're traveling. What's changing? So I think it's obvious to us that the scale is changing. The speed is certainly changing. One of the things that's changing are the purposes of these attacks. We are seeing, certainly in the private sector now, and I saw it certainly in a big way with Sony, we're seeing a rise in destructive attacks. And sometimes it's not just to be purely malicious like North Korea was. Sometimes it is combined with something else. So ransomware is a dual-hatted thing, so to speak. You can pay me, so I'm in it for money, but guess what? Until you pay me, you're locked out of your systems. They might as well be wiped unless you can defeat the way I've set up the encryption or find an encryption key or some other way to recover your data from backup. You're basically hosed. So this has serious implications for our clients at Debevoise and for all companies and governments, because before, perhaps in the target breach era, you might be able to think primarily about buying credit monitoring for people, and you just have to incur that cost of doing business. This is your systems are down. Your people can't card in at the gate when they drive in because it's linked to your computer network. You don't have your calendars. You don't know what's due when for what client. You can't fulfill contracts. And so a lot of my time now is spent training companies through simulations, first figuring out what they have to protect, where it is, what their plan is, and then putting it through a test. I like to quote my favorite cybersecurity expert, Mike Tyson, that it's everybody has a plan until they get punched in the nose. I get to practice punching people in the nose all the time, and they'll say, what can these lawyers cook up? And we cook some pretty good stuff up. You have that evil part of your brain, at least I do. I'll speak for myself, but no, we're very careful about how we do it, and we try to tease out the different gray areas. And they may say, well, maybe we should just get a purely technology firm to test us. I can tell you that when the board or the C-suite is in that war room with their hair on fire and everybody's calling, you're hoping that the technology part is taking care of itself. You're wanting answers for them, but you also need to know what your PR people are doing. Do you have disclosure obligations to consumers from a security standpoint? What do you say to the board, your auditors, your regulators? Should you share that with the FBI or Secret Service? It's a lot more than a technology problem. It's a crisis management problem. And so we find that when we do this and do it right and bring in our experiences in this, people have there's a holy bleep moment. There's a deer in the headlights like, wow, this is what this means. And sometimes people will say, hey, I'm with the service desk, or I'm the important person. I'll give a different example. I'm the important person. Can I come in at the end and do my part? No, I want you to hear how the service desk person or help desk person is processing things. I want you to see the sausage making. We're going to have them talk out loud. And then they're going to sit there while you say what's important to you and what your lens is. And sometimes people are shocked at how other people, what they have to deal with as a practical matter, the volume they're dealing with, that they can't just raise everything up. Sometimes it is, you know, I can't believe you didn't tell me about that. And sometimes it is, you mean you didn't tell me about that? Here's a plastic salad fork and I have to stop them. When you find out your IT director may be paying ransoms because they're low-level amounts and it's a nuisance, and you're the legal person, not told. Not good. So lots of moments here, and these destructive attacks have changed a lot. So, you know, what's happening now, and some of the technology folks in here can tell you a lot more, is the scale is just, and the magnitude of this has gone up significantly. When I mentioned these armies, the World War Z army, when we saw this last year, one of the big attacks against Dine Services, which provided services to Netflix and other major internet players, and a bunch of them went down for a period as a result of a botnet attack that was a higher, newer variant of what had happened to the banks when the Iranian groups attacked. So they were blown offline by a massive botnet that was driven or put together by a piece of malware known as Mirai. And Mirai would go out, and at the time was one of maybe 11 different variants of this kind of malware, would go out and not just look for computers per se, but for routers, cameras. You know, depending on your vintage, it can be like the Gremlins movie or the Transformers movie or whatever your movie is. But your toaster oven becomes a weapon against, you know, somebody. Because it has an IP address, and nobody thought to lock that down. They spent zero thought, and they thought, this is convenient. And they put a default password on it, and it's not really easily patchable. Nobody wants to invest in patching it. But it can be commandeered to communicate to somebody's botnet. If they blanket out the malware with the default password, they might end up with 11 million bots and then unleash it on somebody. And so that's what that is. WannaCry, which actually was kind of ransomware and appears to have escaped the barn a little earlier than somebody had intended, was a combination of typical ransomware where there's an infection, the systems are encrypted, you get a ransom note on your screen that says, with a clock counting down, says you have 48 hours or 72 hours to pay X in Bitcoin to this account, you know, and you'll receive instructions and a key. And some of these people are so cheeky that they actually have ratings. You can give them 4 stars or 5, like Uber or some. You can rate your driver. You'll rate them on how good they were at giving you back your keys to the stuff that they locked you out of, like your tax returns, your family photos, or your business records. So it is really something else. But WannaCry spread like rapidly because it took advantage of a file sharing protocol in many corporate networks. And so it just went whoosh across corporate networks very rapidly. And within hours around the world, affecting all of these businesses on a scale that we hadn't seen ransomware do so rapidly before. I refer to digital Darwinism because we're kind of forced to evolve or die. I mean, as a company, you can't just sit there and say, oh, it won't happen to me. And as an individual, you can only go so long, as yesterday kind of makes clear with the Equifax business, without taking some steps to like defend your credit, change your passwords, protect yourself personally through your devices. There are all sorts of violations of, I mean, your finances, your privacy, all sorts of things that are potential. And having a little bit of training and savvy, even as an individual, let alone as a company, is pretty crucial now. These get older and older, school by the day. But, you know, it's a little bit of a sampling. Yahoo was 2 different incidents involving a total of about 1.5 billion user accounts. But in my estimation, is not as bad, impact-wise, as what happened yesterday. with Equifax, what was announced. I guess it was discovered July 29th, but that involved reportedly Social Security numbers and a whole bunch of credit details, whereas Yahoo is harvesting of email accounts. That, by the way, the Yahoo piece suggests a different trend that I've seen, which is large-scale hacks to collect personal information that is not immediately monetizable. Why would you do that? Why would you do that? Well, you can imagine for intelligence purposes, or you can imagine on the criminal side where things are, where you're building profiles on people to have a larger scale yield. But you can certainly imagine why intelligence agencies would want to do that same kind of thing. Some of these were healthcare oriented, particularly disturbing, and you're talking about a sector with pretty thin margins for the most part. A lot of hospitals were hit by not WannaCry, some were hit by WannaCry, but one after it was actually masquerading as ransomware, but it was just a destructive wiper similar to what hit Sony. And a number of hospital systems, especially in the UK, were taken out because they had old operating systems, old stuff, and legacy things that weren't patched, weren't updated, or were no longer supported, and they were disproportionately affected. OPM is the U.S. Office of Personnel Management, where 21.5 million of us had our background checks compromised. Just imagine, without going into detail, in your background check, kind of everything about you, all your strengths and weaknesses. And it's a pretty severe thing. You know, your relatives that live in other countries, the gambling habit that you defeated, the drinking, whatever issue, that or DUI you had when you were whatever, anything about you is going to be in there. It's highly damaging. One of the worst things that the U.S. government has experienced from a just loss of information standpoint. Critical infrastructure. So we've had a pretty robust debate in our country, some may disagree with me, about privacy for the past few years. It is a very good debate to have. What should be the scope of national powers? What should governments be able to do? What are the rights of individuals and so forth? We should continue that debate. Here's the other debate we need to have, which is kind of how do we keep the lights on, literally. We need to prioritize critical infrastructure, and the Trump administration actually took a step in this regard by requiring government systems to go through, have certain standards. I won't get into the details, but right now, if you're in the energy sector, a lot of sectors, it's kind of up to you to decide, in large part, what you need to do. If you're in the financial sector, which is part of critical infrastructure, it's the opposite problem. Everybody's jumped in the pool, as we'll say in a minute, as a regulator to tell you exactly what you should do, as if they know better than you. There's a balance. There's a balance between holding people to standards that the industry experts have said is right, and we regulators prescribing certain specific things because we read some articles and learned something recently. But this is depicting the SWIFT attacks. The SWIFT money transfer system was viewed as this sacrosanct thing, untouchable, inviolable, whatever you want to say. Not so much. Humans are still behind it. Humans still have credentials to execute wires and so forth. And it started with a $100 million wire attempt, only 20 of which was pulled back or stopped. So an 80 million successful wire, and these attacks are continuing to go on, the SWIFT attacks. So we got to find answers to take disaster off the table. You can buy credit monitoring for your credit card customers. It's bad, it's not good, but some of this stuff, when you're talking about the nuclear power industry, is pass-fail. You either get it right, the plant blows up, or not. So when you're talking about SCADA systems, industrial control systems and things, the consequences are potentially serious. Right now, the people that can get in place to hurt us there don't have an immediate desire to pull the trigger. The people who want to get in that place, the ISISes of the world, so to speak, they're not going to wait. They're not going to wait. When they're in position, they're going to try to pull the trigger. So we have to act. The clock is really ticking for us. Nation states. So I have to be careful here, having lived in that world, so I strictly stay to what the Director of National Intelligence, the DNI, and others have said publicly. But I have been part of some of these discussions internationally, and I've been, in particular, for a couple, 2.5 years in the Russia negotiations, and you get a little feel for how people think about these issues. There are many more countries active in the space. Sophistication has gone up across the board. It's not just the usual, suspects, the U.S., Russia, China anymore. There are a lot of other states involved. North Korea's attack on Sony is an example of that. Sometimes people go crazy with that, and it makes for an easy false flag opportunity. And I'll give you one that I think is a false flag, which is the supposed North Korean orchestration of the SWIFT attack. First call I got from the media, first day, I said, really don't think that's North Korea. But they found pieces of code and so forth. I wouldn't think it's that simple. And why would the North Koreans use the same code that they used in Sony a 1.5 years later and have their fingerprints all over it? I really don't think it's the North Koreans. So you also see false flag activity by various groups and people. So I can tell you that the people that are living in glass houses, as represented by the second to last bullet, leading nations scrambling to protect critical infrastructure, they're really scrambling. If you're North Korea and you have the gross national product of a local Walmart, perhaps, or less, then it's hard to hurt you. You could be sanctioned from so many angles. I don't know how many IP addresses you actually have, but it's not many. And it's really hard to hurt you. Here is the big one, and this was the shock to me. I'm having trouble reading that clock with the glare, but I think we started at 10 after, right? Excellent. Thank you, Chris. I think we started at like 9 after, so I'm maybe going to take the liberty of going to that. Don't feel constrained to stay. If I'm boring or you have another class or there's a game on or something, feel free. No offense. I had no idea when I took the national security portfolio as deputy assistant AG that they built. They said, it's cyber, and cyber something. And I said, all right, well, okay. What else is in this? CFIUS, the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States. I'm like, I don't know anything about that. What is that? Oh, this is whenever, there's a purchase by a foreign concern of some asset or widget in the United States affecting the U.S. supply chain. And this committee, this highly secretive group, chaired by the U.S. Treasury, but with other agencies around in this closed room, decides, based on national security in particular and other factors. And I was in charge of looking at all of these transactions for that 2.5-year period, and it was an eye-opener, because you realize the hacking stuff from afar is bad. It's bad enough. But the real threat is how to manage, how to balance trade and what you want is an open, freewheeling commercial environment with the foreign investment risks. How do you let somebody come and connect with your infrastructure or supply integrated circuits to your military, or connect to your telecom backbone, or whatever it is? How do you do that and manage the risks from a national security perspective of failure to deliver, potential intelligence operations and other things? People saw this publicly with the whole Huawei discussion. And this is pre my time in the National Security Division, but should the U.S. government and others be ingesting Huawei equipment, or is there some sort of spying risk by China? And I can tell you that China is worried about the same thing from the U.S. and others. This is not just a U.S. Team America problem. This is a world problem. And so Everybody is tightening the screws, making it very hard for these transactions to go through, but at what cost? How do we get to a position where we have a safe zone of trust, or we have some independent party that can monitor or vet this? Huge problems with significant consequences. What have some of the government reactions been, real quick? The U.S., and this is where the knuckle draggers like myself came in, would lead multinational operations. We would build an operation. I would fly to the European Cybercrime Center or somewhere else, fly to The Hague, and bring together 12, 15 countries, and we would decide who could participate in this operation, and how would we manage the data, and how would we share things, and who had what laws, and who had what targets in what districts. So we could coordinate multinational operations, and we were successful in things like Game Over Zeus. I was brought in at the end to sort of referee in the Silk Road matter, although other people had the substance of that. But you have to coordinate among various governments, and that's the space I find the most fun in the law, is the international space. U.S. law is fun, I suppose, but it's really cool when you can make stuff work cross-border and culturally, and I love, being parachuted into some place, trying to learn something about their code and system, trying everything to show respect and be a partner and have a really mutually successful outcome. It's a hard thing to do, and it doesn't always work. U.S. has focused on sanctions. If we can't arrest them, we'll sanction their government or their company or whatever. I have to say, I kind of like it. I wish it were used more consistently. I would like to see there be no political hint of any use of sanctions at all. People will always interpret them politically, but they are a powerful tool. I'm a big fan of you pull this lever and this hand smacks you, regardless of who you are, where you are. I found, sitting across the table from hardened gangsters, people, Russian cybercrime people, whatever, they're not impressed by waving around emotions and so forth. They're impressed by, guess what? The train is leaving the station. This is what you're going to get if we're successful. I think we'll be successful. You talk to your lawyer and decide. I'm going to step out. I'm going to give you 8 minutes. I had far more success with that than, oh, we're really mad at what you did. This was bad. And, come on. Come on. After what some of these people have been through, you don't scare them. Some suburban brat walking in there threatening them, come on. They're not afraid of that. So I have been a big fan of sanctions applied, methodically across the board, regardless of geopolitics. Sharing platforms, everybody wants to share everything with everybody, and there's whole books, and that's a whole nother presentation. Naming and shaming is an interesting thing. This is the PLA case and a couple other cases, and the Bogachev case, the Russian guy holding the cat, his very sexy cat that he had there. When you can't arrest the person, do you out them publicly? And the answer is, sometimes I think it's a good move. Sometimes. My next slide, I think, perhaps deals with the PLA issue. We should be declassifying a lot of information. There was a classification bonanza going on for a while. What's happening among the regulators is none of them were involved in this except for the Federal Trade Commission until the last couple years. Now they've all jumped in the pool, as I say. They're all passing, their regulation, and it's a patchwork that's forming up, creating a different problem for industry. It's become a compliance nightmare, and I'm not sure that much of it's making us safer. Thankfully, those who put together the National Institute of Standards and Technology framework for cybersecurity in 2014 are looking pretty prescient right now, because people were like, there's not enough meat on those bones. It's all wishy-washy, and you have to decide based on risk. Now guess what industry wants? Give us that. Please don't force us into all these strict requirements. Give us a risk-based, flexible approach. So now people are making a movement back to NIST, and the more forward-thinking regulators are deciding, hey, maybe that's what we should be, the approach we should be taking is risk-based, so that one size doesn't fit all companies or people, but that these are the factors you should consider in designing your cybersecurity defenses. I'm probably going to blow through this. There's a lot happening in Europe and other parts of the world. one of the sad things going on is data localization. And a lot of this is spurred by the fallout of the Snowden business, where people have said, what the heck, we can't trust providers in the West and so forth. We can't trust this. The US and whoever other countries we're going to require localized data where we are. And the cynical side of the argument is, you haven't invented anything in the last 60 years, and this is your way of forcing a plant to go up down the street, not your fear of the NSA or something. I'm not here to tell you what's right or preach politics. I'm just pointing out different sides of the argument. But a bunch of people have said it all has to be kept here, and now China's saying our data, if it affects any of our citizens anywhere in the world, it has to be governed here if you want to do any business here. And it's actually sad that we have this, because it's balkanized, to use a cliche, the internet. It's carved it up into a million pieces, and everything is kind of going through a straw and raising the costs for industry. Some of our clients will say, we're so daunted by what Europe is doing on privacy regulations and data control, we cannot justify opening there. We're not going to do our Bitcoin startup there or our launch there, because they're so in love with regulation and fines that we're afraid we can't make it work cost-wise. So they'll look at Brazil or other places where they can make it work. So I got a call on a Friday night at DOJ. I guess this was, I have to think when this was, 2015, I think. Yeah, September 2015. President Xi was coming for his first official state visit to the White House. Big, important not to be embarrassed. Cyber was the potential embarrassment issue. Hence, highly motivated to do negotiations about cyber issues. And so, for years, the U.S. has tried to say, look, can we all agree, guys, we should not use our nation-state hackers to steal trade secrets from private companies. Spying, okay. And we all have spying programs. Every developed government and country in the world has an online spying program. Every single one. So we can, that's fine. For national security interests, whatever, or perhaps if it's, the next F-35 plan or whatever, perhaps that's different. It may still be a criminal act, but nobody's going to go to the UN and pound on a soapbox and say, you should have never done that. But when you're going to steal U.S. Steel, in my hometown, Pittsburgh, you're going to steal their proprietary drilling technology or something from Westinghouse or Alcoa and give it to your national champion steel producer so they don't have to spend 3 to 5 years of R&D doing that, and then they're going to dump it in the market and families are going to get laid off, then we're in for a fight. Then we're going to name your government hackers and put their faces all over the screen and embarrass you. And so, that was the stage for this call on a Friday night. Can you please come to the White House, by 8 o'clock to negotiate? The Chinese want to negotiate. And so there were something like 8 of us locked in a room overnight to negotiate with the Chinese delegation 10 days or 2 weeks or so, 10 days ahead of President Xi's visit. And with great motivation on the other side, we were able to be successful and reach an accord where both companies said, among other various things, that we're not going to use our national security hackers, our government assets, to steal trade secrets from companies to give to private companies of our own. And this was a big breakthrough, because then things opened up in Europe and other places where this had been a sticking point because people were worried about angering China. And now China was on board with it, so it was okay. You can debate whether it's affected Chinese hacking of these things. Some in the security research community say the activity's down pretty dramatically. In an environment where no legislation could be passed come hell or high water, this was one of the only things to be passed was a cybersecurity law about sharing to encourage sharing platform. Chris?
Yes, on the previous slide, the U.S. hasn't just named and shamed. Do you want me to use them?
The U.S. government hasn't just named and shamed foreign hackers working for nation states who have stolen commercial data. They've also, in recent years, particularly in the last year, named and shamed foreign state-supported hackers who have engaged in what you might call sort of traditional espionage. And then this year, a group called shadow brokers, who are believed to be working, or either working for the Russians or linked to the Russian government, had been in turn naming and shaming former NSA hackers. And so I'm wondering, given your sort of former perch in the government, do you think that by opening the door to us naming and shaming foreign government employees who are engaging in traditional spying against the US, that we may have inadvertently opened the door to foreign governments doing that to US government employees and US government contractors? And now that that is happening and the Russians are in fact naming and shaming NSA employees and contractors, do you think that was a good door to open?
I actually think the Russians opened it in 1999 in the Ivanov-Gorchkov case. If you remember that one, the US lured a Russian hacker to Seattle. He was somebody who was causing hacking damage, but he had his resume on monster.com or something. And the US saw it and said, hey, let's offer him a job and some tickets to come to Seattle for an interview. And he said, yeah, I'd like to come. Can I bring my business partner? Which was code for us for handler, like mafia handler. And we said, sure. I wasn't part of this, but have another ticket. He came in, and they said, all right, you can't take your laptop upstairs, sir. You know, leave that with us. And he goes up, and he goes to a boardroom in a fake office set up by the U.S. government with like people from the U.S. Attorney's Office pretending they're a .com, sitting there typing pretend stuff. And they bring him in the room, and they said, you know, how do we know you have all these goods on our competitors? Well, if I had my laptop, I could prove that to you. Oh, well, here's the laptop. Put here, we won't look. They had keylogging software on there, and he entered his password and accessed a server in Russia and showed them stolen wares from their competitors, reason they should hire him. He had the dirt on their competitors. And they said, oh, thank you very much. You're under arrest, and we have your password for Russia. And then, according to the Russians, a couple of the FBI agents logged in, and they did a big press conference, public indictment. When the U.S. arrested one of their recent hackers, Sergei Lavrov called a press conference and declared the team international criminals. So they've been naming and shaming. I think, Chris, your point's a really good one. It's a free-for-all now. It's a free-for-all in terms of everything from outing government employees to releasing people's inboxes to influence elections to all sorts of things. It's just soft power going crazy now everywhere. But it's a great point. You certainly encourages people to do that kind of stuff when you do it. All right, let's get to the money slides here at the end. Oh, for you litigators, here's what's happening in that space. Future litigators of America. It used to be that when your data was hacked and you couldn't show anybody used it, that you were not going to get standing to bring a claim, or the class wouldn't be certified by the court. The courts are now changing that. You may have read the Spokio decision by the Supreme Court, and there were a bunch of circuit splits on this. The courts are now past that. People are tired of the stack of credit monitoring letters and things they have from various places. And the courts are saying, you know what, there's a substantial risk of harm to you. Class certified, case goes on. What's the implication? The plaintiff's bar is now like, great, we can get a settlement out of this, and we can get into discovery, and we'll ask for everything that they did before and put a microscope back on how they did their risk assessment, how they handled the breach. And so the role of lawyers and all of the things that came before and in the handling of the incident is now huge. Privilege issues, sensitivity about how things are phrased, all very important. Senior management and boards can no longer be on the sidelines. In my humble opinion, the way we got into the cyber problems is an E equals MC squared view of cybersecurity, where I call it the IT Vegas syndrome. What happens in IT stays in IT. The IT department waits till something is about to explode and festers, and then it rockets up to the C-suite of the company. The CEO is clueless about the stuff, hasn't engaged on it ever, is on a plane to Singapore and will be available in 10 hours. It's chaos. And so regulators and plaintiffs' attorneys are now realizing that boards and senior management have to be on the hook, have to engage in the process. I don't know whether these slides are going to be available. I'll talk to the folks about it, but sharing is a big issue. We have to have the credibility as a country to lead multinational operations. I'm not being political. I'm saying this is the continuum between nationalism and internationalism. If we're going to be nationalistic in some areas, I wouldn't make law enforcement aspects of it, especially against cybercrime or terrorism, one of those nationalistic flavored things. Foreign investment mistrust I mentioned. Trump cyber. A lot of people are asking, does this mean we can hack back at our adversaries because he seems tough talking and there's a John Wayne thing going on? Should we be able to hack back now? Still, the answer from DOJ is no. You're going to cause havoc because a lot of these people come through innocent systems and you will cause more damage by hacking back. And we don't want to receive from Germany or the Netherlands a treaty request about you, where we're supposed to turn evidence over to them about you who started out as a victim and are now a target of a foreign government. I think, all right. Industry, okay, let's do this. Suggestions moving forward. I think we really need to keep the world moving to a smaller place in cyber from an enforcement standpoint. Most of these cases are relationship driven. I made friends all over the world. You could have taken out people that did the last 25 cases a couple years ago in a bar in New York at a conference. I mean, it was the same Germans and Dutch and people, a few of us around the world that did these cases. And so those relationships have to continue to grow and not be ruined by geopolitics or mistrust. We need threat intel sharing. Cross-border data transfer needs to be reasonable. It can't all be through a straw. There are privacy matters, but there's also stopping terrorism, and criminals tend to be violating people's privacy as well, not just governments. We need to modernize the global evidence exchange process. It's a dinosaur, the mutual legal assistance treaty process by which we exchange evidence. I've been in many of those sausage-making meetings. It's really broken. And it really is people's relationships along the side of it that kind of patch things, spackle things together. So that's it. And I will not hold you for any more questions. I will instead stay, and you guys can, anybody that feels like they haven't already been victimized enough by this talk, can come by, and I'm happy to answer your questions. Yes, I don't want to miss plugging the panel because you're going to hear from great folks. I'm going to tag on to the corner of the panel, but Professor Chris is going to lead it, and we have a really great group. I'm a little angry at my friend Megan making this hurricane excuse, not coming, but she's going to Skype in. I'm going to Skype it in, she said. But she's fantastic. It's a great panel. Chris Seguin is privacy expert and will add a lot of nice balance and insights to the panel. It's going to be very good. So I hope to see you at 2:30. Thanks, guys.